What's up, legends? Welcome back to my Unmatched Strategy Guide series. Today's episode is on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, who, unfortunately, are only the second best Dr.-Mr. pair in the Cobble and Fog set. Before we get into the normal proceedings, I want to make a brief announcement. I covered the first two revealed Yennenga cards in my Invisible Man video, and for those who do not know, Yennenga is the first announced hero from the Battle of Legends Volume 2 set, which is supposed to get released sometime this century, hopefully. You can pause the video if you want to look at the cards, and we'll get right into the stats. Jekyll and Hyde is a melee fighter with 16 health and a move value of 2. They are a solo hero. I guess it's weird because there's technically two characters, but they're within the same vessel or body or miniature. They are a form-switching hero like Alice, but we'll talk about that when we get to their ability. Being a move 2 hero, for the most part, doesn't really matter for this character because Jekyll doesn't really need to move around that often, and Mr. Hyde will, more often than not, make use of movement effects on your cards and schemes more than he will maneuver. But when you do have to maneuver as Hyde, it is not great to only be able to move 2 spaces unboosted, so you might find yourself having to boost a lot of your movement if you are in that scenario as Hyde. 16 hero HP is just above average. The average is currently 15 and change, and for a solo hero, it's pretty good because the other true solo heroes right now are Bruce Lee, who has 14 health, and the Invisible Man, who has 15 health, and I guess Deadpool's coming out, and he has 10 health. So 16 health seems pretty good comparatively to those heroes. Your ability will cause you to take damage, so it is nice that your health is on the higher side, and you do also have some pretty decent block cards and healing that will make it a little bit higher artificially. Now, you are a solo hero, so you have no sidekicks to take any hits for you, so your total health pool is still only 16 because you're the only character on the board, and that is decently below average. So one thing that will help your gameplay as Jekyll and Hyde is if you avoid losing a bunch of health early in the game specifically. Mostly because you play better when you're ahead of your opponent on life. So if you can either just avoid losing health early or put your opponent in the hole early, that will make the entire game a lot easier for you. Something interesting about solo heroes is that they kind of abstractly function a little bit differently than other heroes do because they don't have sidekicks that can attack the enemy for them or block the enemy from attacking them. So your board presence in that way is greatly less than other heroes, and you have less flexibility for attacking your opponent because all your attacks come from the same body. You only have one miniature on the board, and someone like Robin Hood, who has 5 fighters on the board sometimes, can attack you from anywhere, whereas Jekyll and Hyde, there's only one fighter. So there are some scenarios where your opponent can wedge their sidekick in between you and their hero, and it can make it very difficult to hit them, which is a downside of being a solo hero, but that's just something you have to play around, and that's part of the challenge. In terms of deck composition, you have 13 unique cards, which is about average. 10 or 11 is generally preferred, and 16 and 17 means your deck will be slightly more inconsistent from game to game. But the thing that affects Jekyll and Hyde the most is your individual hands that you draw and certain combinations of cards. You have a bunch of Jekyll-only cards, a bunch of Hyde-only cards, and some any cards. And there are specific cards, mostly Hyde cards, that you want to draw when your hand is full. And if you don't get specific combinations, that can be kind of bad. You want 2 or 3 Hyde attacks or schemes when you have a full hand, or you want Forever Hyde and a bunch of Jekyll cards. And sometimes if those things don't line up, you will have to take a suboptimal turn. And we'll see specifically in the card section what those ideal combinations look like. For your ability, it says, start the game as Dr. Jekyll. At the start of your turn, you may transform into Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. And while you are Mr. Hyde, after you maneuver, take 1 damage. So there are 3 things to unpack from this ability. The first says you start the game as Dr. Jekyll. You have a form token, much like Alice has a size token, that you will use to indicate what form or personality you currently are, and you start the game as Dr. Jekyll. This is good because Dr. Jekyll has most of your good block cards, and if you had a choice of which form to start as, you'd probably choose Dr. Jekyll every time anyways, so no complaints there. The next part is you get to choose whether or not to transform at the start of your turn. This is a big change compared to Alice, who can only change sizes when she plays a card effect that lets her. So this start of turn choice gives you a much easier time when planning out your turns, because you can just decide to be Jekyll or Hyde at the start of your turn, and based on what your hand is, you can choose the better one. Whereas Alice's size change has a little bit more flexibility because she, of course, isn't restricted to playing certain cards or not, whether or not she's big or small. So there are pros and cons to each, but being able to always choose at the start of your turn is very nice. Now, the downside of this ability is while you are Mr. Hyde, you take 1 damage. This is a penalty because Mr. Hyde can deal a lot of damage to your opponent, and thematically, it kind of hurts Jekyll and Hyde to be Mr. Hyde because he's evil or something like that. I don't really know the lore behind this character. I haven't read the book. But anyways, you take damage when you maneuver. So there are a couple ways to avoid this. The first thing is, if you need cards, draw them when you're Dr. Jekyll, because of course he doesn't take damage, so it just makes sense. The second thing is, as I mentioned in the stats part, you have a bunch of movement effects on your cards and schemes that let you move without maneuvering, and being able to set up Hyde with those effects instead of maneuvering is greatly preferred to maneuvering and taking damage. And the last thing you can do to avoid maneuvering as Hyde is make your opponents come to you and end their turn next to you, otherwise known as kiting with disadvantage, as I call, which means the attack pattern of your opponent will generally be maneuvering towards you first action and then attacking you second action. And most heroes, at least melee ones, except for Bruce Lee, will be ending their turn next to you, and that gives you a great chance to double attack them as Mr. Hyde, which is something you would really, really like doing. Now, losing health isn't the biggest of problems because you do have some healing that can offset it, but generally it'd be better if you were taking a majority of your damage from your opponent hitting you rather than you hurting yourself with your ability. Now, the main issue that comes from this personality form switching is that your block cards will be an issue because Mr. Hyde really only has like 5 good block cards to play. So if your opponent attacks you pretty frequently as Mr. Hyde, that's going to be an issue in the long run. And something that isn't apparently obvious is that you have some transformation effects on your cards that let you switch, but for the most part, you'll be transforming using the start of your turn ability, which means that if you are Hyde on your turn, you're most likely going to be Hyde on your opponent's turn, and that's when the block cards can be an issue. So any cards that let you transform back to Dr. Jekyll after being Mr. Hyde have some intrinsic usefulness to them if you then have Dr. Jekyll cards to block with. So let's talk about your general game plan for these 2 characters, because all the Cobble and Fog heroes generally have a little bit more strategic planning required in order to play them really well, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are no exception. You should use Dr. Jekyll like 75% of your turns. You should only transform into Mr. Hyde if you have some specific thing or mostly attacks or schemes to play against your opponent. So Dr. Jekyll is like the default form that you'll generally be in for most of the game. Your goal as Jekyll is to draw cards, because of course Mr. Hyde isn't very good at drawing cards without taking damage. You have healing cards and blocking cards that will keep you alive. So Dr. Jekyll is like the defensive side of this coin. Hyde, on the other hand, is really good at killing your opponent, which is something that Dr. Jekyll can't really do. You have a ton of really good attacks and some schemes that deal direct damage to your opponent. So he's very powerful and very lethal. However, because of his block cards and the fact that he hurts himself whenever he maneuvers, you should use him a little bit more sparingly. So, speaking of Hyde, or the devil, I guess, let's talk about his cards. The first card is Forever Hyde, a Mr. Hyde only 5 value attack with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It says, during combat, you may discard Dr. Jekyll cards. Add 2 to this card's value for each card discarded. This card is insane. Just like Beast Form from Dracula's deck, this is a discard-based attack that pumps up the value, and you can get to some insane heights with this card. It is the driving force behind this deck because you can kill your opponents out of nowhere. Not really out of nowhere because you have to have a pretty big hand, but you can end games that you had no business winning with this card, and for that reason, you can almost never count Jekyll and Hyde fully out of any match that they're in. Now, this card is a little bit different than Beast Form. It's a 5 value attack instead of 6, and instead of being able to discard any cards, you have to discard Dr. Jekyll cards, and it adds 2 to the value instead of 1. So 5 value attacks are pretty good. If it gets fainted, you still deal 3 damage, which is really nice. Now, discarding Dr. Jekyll cards is not that great because Dr. Jekyll is the more defense-focused form, so those are the cards that keep you alive, and if you discard all of them too early in the game, you're going to run into some problems later in the game when your opponent attacks you and you just run out of things to block with. There are also only 11 Jekyll-only cards in your deck, which means there are some points where you'll have Forever Hyde in a full hand, and maybe you'll only have one Jekyll-specific card, 1 or 2, in your hand, and you can't get it as high as you would like. So if that's the case, just attack with a different Mr. Hyde attack because your opponent doesn't know how many Jekyll cards you have in your hand. The other thing is you can't discard any cards. They specifically have to say Dr. Jekyll in the banner on the left. So in that way, having only 11 cards to pump into this can be a little bit of a downside, but generally you don't discard more than like 2 or 3 unless you're really going to end the game. So the consistency with drawing hands isn't really an issue that I've found. Although it does suck that this attack is only limited to being able to do 27 damage, but you know, I'll take what I can get. The existence of this card means you're really scary with a full hand because you could deal 9, 11 damage very easily, and your opponent doesn't want to let you do that. So a lot of times, if you have more cards in your hand than your opponent, and they can afford to just double maneuver away from you on their turn, they'll probably do that to avoid giving you an easy opportunity to attack them. So just keep that in mind that sometimes you have to stay close to your opponent so that they can't run too far away. And especially when your hand is full, if there's no reason for your opponent to come in and attack you, they probably won't. This card is insane, maybe one of the strongest cards in all of Unmatched because it's literally unmatched in the values that it can reach. Yeah, that might have been a bad pun. Anyways, the next card is Recoiling Blow, a Mr. Hyde only 5 value attack with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It says, after combat, place Mr. Hyde in any space in his zone. Transform to Dr. Jekyll. This card reminds me a lot of Disengage, which is a 4 value attack that lets you move your fighter to any space in your zone, which works really well against melee fighters because it resets the advantage for your kiting. They have to move and then attack you on their turn, but it doesn't work against ranged fighters because unless you're in a very specific scenario where you're standing on a multi-zone space and your opponent is not, and you move to a different zone with this effect, most of the time you will still be in the same zone as your opponent, and they'll get to attack you again. Now, transforming to Dr. Jekyll is very good, especially because this is an attack, so you'll play it on your turn, which means if the transformation goes through, you'll be Dr. Jekyll for your opponent's turn, and you'll have a better time or more options or better options blocking their attacks. Something to point out though, because Forever Hyde exists, your opponent is probably going to cancel a lot of your Mr. Hyde attacks. This is fine because it's a 5 value attack. It's really good. It still deals 3 damage through a feint, but you won't get the effects And the effects are pretty good on this card because you get to move your fighter away from your opponent, which is always good against melee heroes, and it transforms you, which is crucial for staying alive long term. And being Hyde on your opponent's turn, like, it isn't a big, huge deal if it happens once or twice, but you generally don't want to let your opponent attack Hyde every opportunity they get because your options are kind of limited. You have like 5 good 4-value block cards, and everything else is leaving a little bit to be desired. So just keep that in mind when you play this card, that there's a good chance it'll be fainted, but you'd rather this get fainted than Forever Hyde, and have a backup in mind. It's a very powerful attack, which Hyde has a lot of. The next card is Madness Relents, a Mr. Hyde only 4-value versatile with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It says, after combat, transform to Dr. Jekyll. So this is the only Mr. Hyde specific versatile card you have, and while you can attack with it, I highly recommend you block with it because it is basically the best block card Mr. Hyde has at his disposal. Blocking 4 points of damage is really good because that's just a lot of health you save, and the effect is really nice because it transforms you into Dr. Jekyll, which you would much rather be on defense. This is subtly very powerful because a lot of times Mr. Hyde will end his turn next to the opponent because a lot of his schemes and attacks don't let him move away afterwards. Recoiling Blow would be the exception there, but as I mentioned, that's probably going to get fainted sometimes. So when you're stuck next to your opponent as Mr. Hyde on their turn, they can double attack you, knowing that besides this card and Skirmish, you don't really have any good options for blocking a lot of damage, and they'll try to wallop you. If you play this on their first attack, you'll transform, and then you'll be Jekyll for their second attack, which is a much less desirable option for them because they can probably do some more nasty effects to you while you're Mr. Hyde. So it's really good in that regard, and sometimes it might even dissuade your opponent from attacking you twice, even though they have the opportunity to. Now, I mentioned you could use this as an attack, but Forever Hyde, Recoiling Blow, a card we'll see later called Duality of Man, and some of the schemes you have are generally all better options that don't reduce your card pool for blocking. So unless you're really trying to bait out Forever Hyde, you're trying to get rid of your opponent's feints desperately, I would probably not attack with this card. This is a great backup card to have in your hand if you think that your Recoiling Blow will get fainted. So this is a really good block card as Mr. Hyde. The next card is Pure Evil, a Mr. Hyde only scheme with a boost value of 3 and 3 copies. It says, place Mr. Hyde in any space in his zone. Mr. Hyde deals 2 damage to all adjacent fighters. So something I'm probably going to say about 20 times throughout the course of this video is that non-maneuver movement effects are really good for Mr. Hyde because they can set him up without him having to take the health penalty for maneuvering himself. And in that regards, this card is a very good first action because you can use it to close the distance between your opponent, deal some damage, and then attack them because you'll be adjacent to them. It's just a really nice turn. You feel really happy with that. It's really good in the area of effect sense because it deals more than 1 damage. So against enemies who don't have 1 health sidekicks, dealing 2 damage to their sidekick is better than dealing 1 damage, obviously. Single target schemes that deal 2 damage are kind of standard. So if you can hit at least 2 things with this scheme, you feel really good about that. But just dealing 2 damage to 1 thing, usually the enemy hero, is enough to feel satisfied after using this card. You can compare this to Jackalope Horns and Never Leave the Path from Bigfoot and Little Red's decks, respectively, which are both also very solid damage schemes that kind of do something like this. However, this card seems really good, and it is, but it's very easy to play around, which will probably be its downfall because the restriction on moving is confined to Mr. Hyde's current zone, which is very easy for your opponent to just look at the map and position themselves somewhere where you cannot reach them by using a Pure Evil. And if they do that, if they play around this card pretty aggressively, that really hurts you because you have 3 copies of this. It's a really good first action as Hyde if your opponent isn't right next to you. And being denied this effect repeatedly throughout the game probably makes it a lot harder for you to win, and it kind of sucks. The benefit of that downside is that the boost value is 3. So worst case scenario, you can use this to get to your opponent by boosting your maneuver and having 5 available spaces for you to move to, which most likely you'll be able to reach your opponent with. So if you can't get the effect from the scheme, just use it as a boost card. And even though you're dealing 1 damage to yourself and not 2 to your opponent, you gotta do what you gotta do sometimes, and kudos to your opponent for being smart enough to play around it. Very high potential, but it's also very easy for your opponent to play around, and depending on how experienced they are, your mileage will vary with this card. The next card is Strange Case, a Mr. Hyde only scheme with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It says, reveal the top card of your deck. Deal damage equal to its boost value to 1 adjacent fighter. Put the card in your hand. So this card basically deals damage to your opponent and draws you a card, which is pretty nice. The average value of the other 29 cards in your deck is just over 2. So let's assume that when you play this card, you'll deal 2 damage to your opponent. Just like I said for Pure Evil, dealing 2 damage to a single thing is pretty standard for a scheme, so you can feel happy about that. And it has the potential to deal 3 damage based on some of the boost values in your deck, which is really nice. But at the same time, it could also deal 1 damage, which is not very good for a scheme. So the randomness of it means you can't consistently rely on this for damage, but the fact that you could potentially deal 6 damage with 2 copies of a scheme is really good. The potential downside for this card is that because you're revealing the top card of your deck, your opponent also gets to see it, so they'll know at least one of the cards that you're currently holding in your hand, which most of the time won't really matter that much. Like if you draw a Succumb to Compulsion or a Skirmish or something like that, it doesn't really matter that your opponent knows that you have that card. But if you draw something like a Feint or a Forever Hyde, those cards are much more impactful, and your opponent being able to properly play around them, knowing that you have them in your hand, can kind of hurt you. But I'd say for the most part, it doesn't really matter that you're revealing a card. This card also replaces itself when you play it, which is nice for maintaining card advantage. And if you play this first action, you could potentially draw a Dr. Jekyll card to then play into a Forever Hyde second action. So it's got some niche combo potential there. But the reason why I kind of don't like this card is because often if you play it, you are playing it instead of playing an attack. And all your attacks generally have the potential to deal more damage than this card can consistently. If you can play it first action in the scenario I just described, which means you're starting your turn next to your opponent, I actually feel pretty good about that. But whenever you don't get the opportunity to double attack or play this and then attack your opponent, having to move to your opponent first action just to play this card can feel kind of lackluster and maybe not worth the risk of being Mr. Hyde for that turn. Playing Pure Evil and then playing Strange Case, I think is fine, but if you have to maneuver to your opponent and then play Strange Case, I just feel like most of the time if your hand allows you to do something better, you should probably do that. But if you don't have any Hyde attacks in your hand, or you don't have enough Jekyll cards for Forever Hyde, it's perfectly fine to play this card. In the grand scheme of things, if I had a priority list of attacks or schemes to play against my opponent, Strange Case would probably be last on that list. It's still a good card in the sense that it can deal damage to your opponent, which is something that you can't do as Dr. Jekyll, so you may as well take advantage of when you're Mr. Hyde. It can kind of suck because if you play this card instead of attacking and you deal a whopping 1 damage to your opponent, it can kind of feel like you wasted your turn there. So now for the Jekyll cards. To restate the goals as Dr. Jekyll, you are to draw cards and stay alive so that Mr. Hyde can finish off your opponent, which he can't do if you both die. Now, while your Jekyll cards are good, you have some really good black cards and some okay healing, you don't want to play them, which sounds weird, but your Forever Hyde gets powered by your Jekyll cards, and if you spend them all blocking and healing, maybe sometimes unnecessarily, your Forever Hyde potential goes down with each card you play. So in that sense, a strategy against Jekyll and Hyde is to attack Jekyll a lot instead of Hyde, so that Jekyll is constantly forced to play his Jekyll cards, which makes Forever Hyde a little less good, which I think is a very viable strategy, and so you got to be really careful in that scenario then. The first Jekyll card is Scientific Method, a 2-value block card with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It says, after combat, draw a number of cards equal to the damage you were dealt. This card can get really, really good. Imagine you play this against a larger than life. Sure, you take 4 damage, but you also get to draw 4 cards. That's insane! So this card is really good for pumping up your Forever Hyde because it allows you to potentially draw a ton of cards at once to start your turn with more cards than your maximum hand size would allow, because remember, you discard down to 7 at the end of your turn, not the beginning. So when you play this, it'll be your opponent's turn, and you'll draw cards, and you might be able to have more than a full hand, which makes your Forever Hyde a really juicy option in that scenario. So it's a really good setup or prep card if you have a Forever Hyde ready and you need some, maybe just a couple more Jekyll cards to pump into it. Now, blocking 2 damage isn't that great, but this card, there's clearly a trade-off where you're trading health for cards, and especially if you have health to spare at the beginning of the game because you got an early lead, you feel perfectly fine sacrificing some health in order to get cards out of this. One issue I should point out before completely glorifying this card is that you don't know what value the attack your opponent played is, which means you might not draw 3 or 4 cards every time you play this card. You might draw 1 or maybe even none, which is really bad if you were expecting to play a huge Forever Hyde next turn. So you kind of don't want to get baited. Not kind of, you don't want to get baited by like a regroup or something when you play this card, which can be a little hard sometimes because Hyde has 5 good 4-value blocks for him, and the options tend to drop off after that, which means your opponent is probably going to focus most of their attacks into Hyde and maybe bait out the Madness, Relents, and the Skirmishes so that later in the game they can land something like a Beast Form or a Larger Than Life, which means you might not get your opponent's best attacks thrown at Jekyll, which you'd want to with this card because you want to take a lot of damage from their attacks. But you might get like their second or third or even fourth best options thrown at Jekyll instead of Hyde. So there's more room for them to bait you, especially if they know you have this card with bad attacks than with Hyde. And you're probably not going to get their largest attack thrown at you. So this card has a ton of potential, but depending on the way your opponent plays, if they try to aggressively go after Jekyll so you have less for your Forever Hydes, or they try to beat down Hyde over the course of the game, depending on their long-term strategy, you might get a couple different results from this card. But I'd say you have 2 copies, you can probably get a good use out of one of them. There are a couple cards I can think of that remind me of this card, like Looking Glass from Alice's deck, Little Dragon from Bruce Lee's deck, and the Wolf's Skin from Little Red's deck. And each of those cards are 2-value block cards. Little Dragon is versatile, but they each draw 2 cards after combat. And I really like those cards because drawing more than 1 card at a time increases your hand size, helps you get card advantage, and I like it. It's a good effect. So I think if you can draw at least 2 cards from this card, you feel pretty good about that. And because you have the potential to even draw more, I really like this card. The next card is With Haste, except there's an exclamation point, so I have to say it
with haste.
It's a Dr. Jekyll only 4 value block card with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. It says, after combat, move Dr. Jekyll up to 4 spaces. 4 value block cards are really good because most of the good attacks in this game are at least 4, so you'll be blocking a majority of damage from most of your opponent's best attacks. Nice. After combat move effects are also really good. Now, I normally say moving when it's not your turn is a really powerful effect, and that is true, but it's especially true for this deck because moving to set up Mr. Hyde double attacks is very powerful. Let's say Medusa, a ranged hero, attacks you. You can then block with this card and then move Dr. Jekyll up to 4 spaces. Medusa was in the same zone as you to attack you, so 4 spaces can probably reach her. And if Medusa attacked you second action, she won't have another action to move away from you, and you'll start your turn next to her and can probably go hide and deal some nice damage with a Strange Case or Recoiling Blow or some other attack like that, and you feel really good about the way that panned out. The one downside this card has is after combat effects on defense cards trigger before after combat effects on offense cards, because remember, the defender resolves first, which means if your opponent, Medusa in this example, if she played something like a dash that says after combat move up to 3 spaces, you'll move because the defensive effect resolves first, but then your opponent will move because their offensive move effect will trigger after yours, which can kind of nullify the advantage you gained by moving with this card. So be aware that the heroes with attacks that let them move afterwards, don't try to play this card into one of those attacks. However, this will win combats against both skirmishes and leapaways if they're played on offense, which is nice because you get to move and your opponent doesn't. Now, move effects also in general break attack chains, which can be great against heroes like the Raptors and Bruce Lee, because maybe you don't have enough defensive cards in your hand to sustain a 4 or 5 attack Jeet Kune Do barrage from the master himself. So you can use this after one of Bruce's attacks and then move away from him so that he can't repeatedly punch you in the face. This is a really strong card. You only have 2 copies of it, which is a common trend for this deck. You tend to have 2 copies of the best cards, but you have options as Dr. Jekyll. You have a lot of defensive options, and this is a really, really good one. The next card is Succumb to Compulsion, a Dr. Jekyll only 2 value versatile card with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies. It says, after combat, move up to 2 spaces. Transform to Mr. Hyde. So, non-maneuver movement effects are really good for Hyde because you don't have to maneuver as him and you don't have to take the damage penalty. And that's just about where the pros for this card stop because it's not very good. It's a versatile, so you can use it to block or attack, and let's talk about blocking with it first. It's just like with Haste, but a lot worse. It blocks less, 2 instead of 4. You get to move less, 2 instead of 4. And there's a forced hide transformation, which isn't the end of the world if you're using it like with Haste to close a gap between you and the attacker to then be Mr. Hyde on your turn, although you'll be Mr. Hyde anyways because you're transforming and potentially get a double attack in. Although that might be a little hard because moving 2 spaces isn't a lot. It's definitely not as much as 4, and sometimes if a ranged fighter is 3 spaces away while being in the same zone as you, moving 2 spaces just doesn't really do anything. So there's a lot less utility from this as a block card than with Haste, but you do have 3 copies of it. So maybe if you think your opponent is baiting you with a regroup or something small like that you wouldn't want to waste a with Haste on. That sounded weird. You could use this and I guess be satisfied unless they played something really big. Yikes. So it's just a less good version of with Haste on defense, but it's versatile so you can attack with it. And it's interesting to use as an attack because if you're starting your turn next to your opponent, why wouldn't you just be Hyde and use 2 actions to attack or scheme against them instead of being Jekyll for 1 action, attacking them with something that's only 2, and then transforming to Hyde and only getting 1 action as Hyde against your opponent. I guess this is kind of a bait attack, except your opponent knows that all the Jekyll attacks are bait attacks, so they generally wouldn't fall for it. I don't know. It's just not very useful as an attack. I guess you could use it first action to attack your opponent's sidekick or something, then use the movement effect to like bounce to their hero if they were 2 spaces away, and then be Mr. Hyde, so you would get to their hero without maneuvering as Mr. Hyde. But that's a very niche scenario that probably won't present itself in all games, but that specific thing is probably the best case scenario for using this card. I generally just save this card and dump it into a Forever Hide because it's just the value you get from this is just not very good, and it's much better as 2 damage and a bigger attack. The next card is Distracted Triage, or Triage as I like to call it. It is a Dr. Jekyll only 3 value versatile card with a boost value of 3 in 2 copies. It says, after combat, if you won the combat, recover 2 health. This has healing on it, potentially, which is really good for you because you would love all the healing you could get as a solo hero and one whose ability damages you sometimes. However, this has the no contest expecteth problem where you don't really win combats with 3 value attacks that often, so it's not really that reliable on offense, and it's not really that reliable on defense either because most of the good attacks in this game are at least 4, which means you just won't win combats. There are some specific decks that rely on low value attacks repeatedly to beat you, like Bruce Lee. This would block most of his Jeet Kune Do cards, but most of the time against most decks, this card is kind of a dud, meaning that it's just a 3 value versatile card with no text on it, which compared to some of the other options you have on both offense and defense is very lackluster. The rare instance you can get away with this card is if you attack your opponent's sidekick, like does Robin Hood really want to spend a card keeping one of his outlaws alive? Or maybe you attack your opponent's hero when they don't have a lot of cards in your hand. Do they really want to block when Jekyll is attacking them instead of Hyde? However, when they do want to block you as Dr. Jekyll, you have this card, Succumb to Compulsion, and Skirmish to attack with. And if you're attacking with Skirmish as Jekyll, your opponent can live with that. But it's pretty easy to just block 3 damage, and whether you play this card or Succumb to Compulsion, you just don't deal anything to your opponent and they walk away unscathed. So it's just a very predictable play because you don't have a lot of options offensively for Dr. Jekyll. So while you might win sometimes if your opponent just doesn't want to block or doesn't want to spend a decent block card to just meet the 3 value, you won't get a lot of use from this card. God, I wish this was a 4 value because then you could actually get the healing from it. So just like Succumb to Compulsion, this is one of those Jekyll cards that I just kind of save to put into Forever Hide because it's probably going to be more useful as 2 damage attached to that effect than it is as a standalone card. The next card is Calming Research, a Dr. Jekyll only scheme with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. It says recover 2 health, draw up to 3 cards, keep 1, and put any others on the bottom of your deck in any order. So this card heals you for 2 and then maybe does something else, which is a really decent effect. We saw in Dracula's deck, Baptism of Blood heals him for 2 and then does something else, and that's a very solid effect. You have 2 copies of this, so if you play both of them, you'll get 4 total points of healing, which is really good for a solo hero who needs all the health he can get. And for that reason, I don't like putting this card into Forever Hide because generally the healing will matter in most games. It says draw up to 3 cards, but in actuality, you're either drawing 1 or 0 cards. You have 4 options. You can draw 0 cards, 1 card, 2 cards, or 3 cards. But either way, you only end up with a net gain of 1 or none cards. So what are some reasons why you wouldn't want to draw a card? In games where you think you're going to go into exhaustion for both decks, it's good to not draw cards so that your opponent's deck empties faster than yours and they reach fatigue quicker than you. It's also good if you have 7 cards in your hand and your opponent double maneuvers away from you because they want to stay away from you as Hyde. They don't want to give you an easy smack to their face. So what you can do is you can stay as Jekyll on that turn, maneuver for 8 cards in hand, and then play this, heal 2, choose to draw 0 cards, and your hand size is still 7, meaning you've essentially delayed yourself overdrawing for a turn, which is a really good stall when your opponent is trying to avoid Hyde. It means on their turn they're probably going to draw 2 more cards, and eventually they'll have to come back and spend some of those cards on you unless they just want to discard them. So it's a really good pass of a turn in that sense. And if you actually are trying to draw cards from this, it's like coded notes from the Invisible Man deck, but worse because the cards you put back go on the bottom of your deck. And this is potentially a huge issue because you really only have 5 bad cards in your deck. Every other card is somewhat decent. So if you draw 2 or 3 cards, there's probably a good chance that both of them are going to be good. And I can recall the very first time I played Dr. Jekyll, I was like, yeah, I'll draw 2 cards. What's the worst that could happen? And I drew a Forever Hyde and a Duality of Man, and I was like, oh, I want both of these cards, but I can't have them both. And scenarios like that feel really bad because you're putting cards at the bottom of your deck, meaning you won't see them until the very end of the game, or you might not even see them at all if the game ends before that, which could potentially be a huge setback if that card is crucial to your game plan. And like I said before, you have 2 copies, only 2 copies, of most of the good cards in your deck. So sending one of them to the purgatory pit at the bottom of your draw pile can really hurt. So most of the time when I play this card, I usually only draw 1 card because I'm too afraid of sending cards to the bottom of my deck. But it can be really useful to draw 3 cards and get many more options than just 1 card, and you get to choose the best one for your specific scenario. This could also help if you're desperate, like you desperately need a card for next turn to close out the game. You're trying to find your last Forever Hyde, so it doesn't matter whatever else you send to the bottom of your deck. You draw the top 3 cards, and you find your Forever Hyde. You get to keep it, and you don't even matter what else you put on the bottom. But if you're just drawing cards in the middle of the game with no sense of urgency, I really don't like having to send good cards to the bottom of my deck. So this card, I think, is much stronger than it looks because you can use it in basically 3 scenarios that I described, and I think they're all generally very good uses of the card. So it's up to you to be able to make the right judgment call on the fly in a game and use it the right way, but it's just a very, very good card. The healing is nice, and the different scenarios when you want to draw and look at different amounts of cards is also very nice. The next card is Duality of Man, my favorite unmatched card of all time. It's an any card, 3 value versatile, with a boost value of 1 and 2 copies. It says, during combat, if you are Dr. Jekyll and playing this card to defend, this card's value is 6 instead. If you are Mr. Hyde and playing this card to attack, this card's value is 6 instead. So that's a huge wall of text for a normal unmatched card, but basically to break it down, there are 4 scenarios where you could play this card. If you are Mr. Hyde and attacking, it's a 6. If you're Mr. Hyde and defending, it's a 3. If you're Dr. Jekyll and attacking, it's a 3. And if you're Dr. Jekyll and defending, it is a 6. So there are 2 really good outcomes, 1 good outcome, and 1 bad outcome. The good outcomes are if you're attacking as Hyde and defending as Jekyll, because then it's a 6 value attack, which are great. We've seen how Larger Than Life and Excalibur are some of the best attacks in the game. It's nice. It's not good if it gets fainted. And as we've said before, Mr. Hyde cards, attacks specifically, are pretty likely to get fainted because your opponent might not want to let you get the effect of Forever Hyde off. So it only deals 1 damage against a feint, which is unideal when something like Recoiling Blow would deal 3, but it's really good when your opponent tries to value block against Mr. Hyde. But of course, you won't really know what they're trying to do until after they do it, so you just got to make the best prediction. When you're defending as Jekyll with this card, it's a 6 value block card, which is crazy. There's only cards like War King, really, which can block that much damage on defense. And the highest natural printed defense card is a 5 in Willow's deck. And other than that, most of them are 4s. So blocking 6 damage on defense is insane. It's awesome. I really like the options you get between this card with Haste and Scientific Method because you have a 2, a 4, and a 6 to block with, and they do various things like moving or drawing cards, and you have a lot of options as Jekyll on defense, and this card is a great value blocker. However, sometimes you don't need to block 6 damage. If your opponent is playing a regroup, you feel like a fool when you block with Duality of Man, and you have 5 extra points of block that you didn't need to spend. So while it is amazing as a block card, just think about if you need to use it as a block card, because Hyde attacking with it is also a very good option. Speaking of attacking, do not attack with this card as Dr. Jekyll. It's a 3 value card with no text on it. Just throw out a distracted triage if you want to do that. And the last case you can use this card in is on defense as Hyde, which is unideal because it's only a 3 and there's essentially no text if you're blocking with it as Hyde. But there are some scenarios where you're Hyde, you weren't planning on being Hyde, maybe your Recoiling Blow got fainted, and now you're stuck with no real good block options in your hand. Most of the time, it's better to block with this and use it suboptimally than it is to just take an undefended attack as Mr. Hyde. So while that option isn't ideal, know that it exists and it might not be as bad as it seems. So like I said before, this is my favorite card in all of Unmatched. It feels so thematic and it's so powerful. It's awesome. It's one of those cards that I wish you had 3 copies of instead of 2 copies of, which is almost every single card in this deck, but I digress. Let's talk about the basic cards now. You have 3 copies of Feint and 3 copies of Skirmish. And we're going to actually get really in-depth with this because we're going to talk about all the different ways to use cards between both Jekyll and Hyde because you have a lot of options. So let's talk about the easy ones first. Scientific Method and with Haste can only be used as Jekyll when you're blocking because they're blue cards. And Hyde can only attack with Forever Hyde and Recoiling Blow because they're red cards. So those are pretty easy scenarios to talk about. Let's talk about blocking with Jekyll a little bit more. I mentioned how Duality of Man rounds out those top 3 blocks as just really good, really solid options. You have a lot of flexibility, whether you want cards, movement, or just pure value. The other options you have to block with as Jekyll are Distracted Triage, which is the 3 value versatile that can heal you if you win the combat. And while I think you shouldn't plan on getting the heal when you block with it, blocking 3 damage is still alright. And you have Succumb to Compulsion, which is a 2 value block card that lets you move after combat and transforms you to Mr. Hyde, which I think should go into a Forever Hyde, and it's fine if you don't use it to block. You also have Skirmish, one of the basic cards that you can use as either Jekyll or Hyde because it's an any, and I recommend saving Skirmishes to block for Hyde with because blocking 4 damage as Hyde is something that he can't do all that often, and you have better options as Jekyll than Skirmish. Feint is interesting, and it's dependent on the matchup a lot because if your opponent has effects-based attacks, like Sinbad, his attacks get really nasty, but because of the effect, you should save your feints for Hyde because he'll get more usage out of that. But if your opponent is like Bigfoot and has value-based attacks, like Larger Than Life, you should use your feints as Jekyll because if you feint a Larger Than Life, Hyde will take 4 damage, and that can kind of suck. But I wouldn't say it's a strict only Jekyll or only Hyde. Feint is feint. You know how to use it by now, hopefully. Use it when you see fit. Let's talk about blocking for Hyde. He has Madness Relents, which is that 4 value versatile card that lets him change to Dr. Jekyll afterwards. And I think Madness and Skirmish are the 2 best cards that Hyde has. And between them, you have 5 copies each. So if you're Hyde 4 or 5 times a game, there should be a 4 value card that you can use to block with and feel pretty happy about. And like I said, Duality of Man is a niche option if you have no other block cards in your hand. It's better to block 3 than nothing as Hyde. And we just talked about Feint. Let's talk about attacking now. Jekyll probably shouldn't attack with him. Mostly because Duality of Man, Skirmish, and Feint are all so much better utilized on defense than they are on offense. And Distracted Triage and Succumb to Compulsion, they're very situational. If you think you can get a heal off with Distracted Triage, sure, go for it. If you want to do that Succumb to Compulsion hide bounce maneuver I talked about, where you attack something with Succumb to Compulsion first action, you move 2 spaces, now you're hide and you can attack something else. But outside of that specific scenario that requires a very specific board state and enemy positioning, just save your triages and compulsions for Forever Hyde. And lastly, let's talk about attacking as Hyde. You have 6 really good options in terms of Forever Hyde, Recoiling Blow, and Duality of Man. And I'd say most of the time, you shouldn't attack with Skirmish or Feint because you're not going to be Hyde that often. So those 6 cards combined with the 2 copies of Strange Case should be the only things you're considering, because there's only 8 copies between those 4 cards, and generally you don't want to waste an opportunity as Hyde to throw out a Skirmish or a Feint as an offensive bait. You want to end the game quickly. You want to throw out your best attacks because you have enough of them to constantly throw out. So please let me know if you have any disagreements about this chart in the comments. I think this was a pretty cool thing to do for this hero specifically, because most other heroes don't need a chart like this where they tell you how to use what card where. But Jekyll is just that complicated that I said, hey, this would be a really good visual for people who just wanted one final wrap up for all the cards in your deck. Oh, it's finally final thoughts time. And this hero, to put it bluntly, is very powerful, but very hard to play. That chart I just showed is a prime example of why, because there's so many different scenarios you could use different cards in, and finding the best one can be really challenging even for someone as experienced as me. Subtle flex, but I'll take it. One of the things that I think makes Hyde hard to play, Jekyll and Hyde that is that it's hard to make comebacks with him, because as I mentioned earlier, when you're the one chasing your opponent, you're at an innate disadvantage because of that, and you have to play a little suboptimally, or that style of play is suboptimal for you to say. And you're weak to early aggression, just like Dracula is, because every card you're using on blocking an opponent's attack is not a card you're putting into your Forever Hyde, or in Dracula's case, his beast form. So against enemies like the Raptors that are just constantly attacking you, your big attack might not seem that big. Another point is that you're constantly presented with a bunch of micro decisions, like which card to attack with when you're Hyde. If you have a Duality of Man, a Strange Case, and a Recoiling Blow, which one do you use? You have a ton of those decisions constantly presented to you. Do you want to be Hyde this turn, even though your Forever Hyde won't be that big, but your opponent might not be expecting it or might not be ready for it? What do I do here? And a lot of these micro decisions, I think, can, maybe not even micro decisions, they're just decisions. You're presented with a ton of decisions, which some of the time can just determine the outcome of a game without you even knowing. And I think you're punished more often than not for making the wrong ones as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that can be a little soul crushing retrospectively. I think Jekyll and Hyde is kind of like the kombucha girl of Unmatched, or at least that was my reaction when I first played him. I was like, I don't know about this guy. And then I was like, oh, this guy can do some damage. And then I was like, oh no, he's just too inconsistent. So that basically sums up my feelings of him. However, as harsh as that conclusion may be, that is purely from a competitive gameplay standpoint. From a design perspective, I think this hero is phenomenal. And now, this may be anecdotal evidence, but a ton of people in the community really like this hero. So I think that is a good reason for why he is fine the way he is. He is my 6th favorite hero, I think. If you've been following this channel for a while, you know my favorite heroes are Bruce Lee and the Raptors, followed by Little Red. 4th is actually Houdini, who I've playtested a couple times. I think he's phenomenal. And my 5th favorite is Beowulf. So Jekyll and Hyde barely makes the top 6, but he is 6th nonetheless. One of my colleagues, Zero Skater 12, Jekyll and Hyde is his favorite hero. And of the 4 design contest winners, that seems like it was announced such a long time ago, 2 of them have Jekyll and Hyde as their favorites. So a bunch of people in the community really like this hero, even though he's bad, which means he is well designed. Compare that to King Arthur, who is bad and no one likes him. So I'm always digging on Arthur, man. I'm sorry. So basically, if I want you to take away anything from this video, it's that characters like Jekyll and Hyde and Alice, who are token flippers or form changers, it's probably a better word to describe it, but characters that do that, they flip between one form and the other. They're really fun to play because you have to plan out your turns and knowing when to change forms, when to stay as your current form. It's a neat little puzzle, and it's entertaining whether or not you win or lose. And having a big attack you can dump cards into, like Forever Hyde, just makes trying to end the game with as much damage as possible just like a fun prospect. Like what's the highest Forever Hyde you've ever thrown at your opponent? Just things like that make playing him fun. So even though he might be a little weak from a gameplay standpoint, I think he is fine because he's fun to play. And that is my video on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Whew! This video was so much fun to make, but also so hard to make because these Cobble and Fog heroes, man, they're all so complicated compared to the earlier heroes. But anyway, that's it for this video. We're going to do the thing we did for the Invisible Man video where if you made it this far and you're still awake, you haven't clicked away, you're not bored yet, leave a comment of a fruit emoji. So that way I know you're a real one and you made it this far. I think I did that for the Invisible Man video, and that was just, it was so funny reading through all the comments with just fruit. I was laughing my butt off reading those, so that was awesome. I hope to have the Sherlock video out by next weekend, which is a very lofty goal. That's like 5 or 6 days away from here. But as many of you know, there is a big announcement coming on the 7th next week, and I want to have my schedule cleared up so I can make a video about that. You already know I'm making a video about that, but yeah, that'll be really exciting. Exciting times we live in where we're having the first announcement of new content since like January. Imagine that. Whew. All right, I'm done talking now. As always, like, subscribe, and yeet!